Witch, you will burn!
Winter, 1692. A hard frost grips the Massachusetts Bay colony. In Salem, the ground is frozen, the fields are dead, and survival feels like a form of prayer. Then something stranger than hunger begins to spread through the village. A girl collapses. Another starts screaming at something no one else can see. A shadow in the corner. A fit no doctor can explain. A finger pointed in the dark. From that moment, Salem begins to change. Neighbors turn against neighbors. Faith becomes accusation. And in a community built on God's law, the law itself begins hunting for witches. Before it is over, 19 people will hang. One man will be pressed to death. And an entire village will mistake fear for justice. This is the unseen past. Before Salem became famous, it was simply a difficult place to survive. Winter came hard, fields failed, illness moved fast. A bad season could leave a family hungry, in debt, or burying a child before spring. The village sat in a world that already felt under siege. To the north and west were frontier wars, raids, and stories of settlements burned in the night. Those stories travelled back with refugees, soldiers, and ministers, and by the time they reached Salem, they no longer sounded like rumours. They sounded like warnings. But the danger people feared most was not always outside the village. It was inside the soul. The people of Salem believed the world was crowded with invisible forces and that God and the devil were both active in daily life. A fever was never just a fever. A run of bad luck was never only bad luck. That way of thinking made ordinary life feel heavier than it was. A stubborn child could be seen as spiritually troubled. A quarrel between neighbors could take on the weight of sin. A woman with a sharp tongue, a man who kept to himself, a family that prospered too quickly or suffered too often, all of them could begin to look suspicious in a place where people were trained to read hidden meaning into everything. And Salem was already full of tension. The village was divided by land disputes, old grudges, and arguments over who should hold power. Some families wanted the village to stand on its own. Others still looked toward Salem town. Even the church was a source of conflict, not comfort. At the center of that conflict stood Reverend Samuel Parris. He was stern, demanding, and deeply unpopular with many of his own parishioners. Some saw him as a defender of order. Others saw him as a man who turned every disagreement into a test of loyalty and every criticism into an attack on God's authority. So, by the time the winter of 1692 settled over Salem, the village was already strained to its limit. It was tired, suspicious, devout, and divided. Nothing had broken yet, but the ground beneath the community had begun to crack. All it needed now was one event no one could explain, one household thrown into panic, one sign that the invisible world had stopped watching from a distance and stepped into the room. It started inside Reverend Samuel Parris's house, the one place in Salem that should have felt most protected. His 9-year-old daughter Betty began falling into violent fits. She screamed, crawled under furniture, twisted her body into shapes that frightened everyone who saw them and seemed to recoil from things no one else could see. Then Abigail Williams began doing the same. The two girls were not just sick, they were unpredictable. One moment they were silent, the next they were crying out, shaking, choking, or collapsing to the floor as if something invisible had struck them. Adults rushed in, prayed over them, held them down, tried to calm them, and failed. Word spread quickly because this was not the kind of suffering Salem knew how to name. Fever, injury, hunger, childbirth, these people understood. But this was something else, something theatrical, frightening, and public. A body could convulse in front of a room full of witnesses, and no one could say why. A local doctor, William Griggs, was called in. He found no clear physical cause. In another place, that uncertainty might have led to patience. In Salem, it opened the door to something far more dangerous. If medicine had no answer, then perhaps the answer was spiritual. That idea moved through the village with terrifying speed. The girls were not simply unwell, people said. They were afflicted, bewitched, attacked by an enemy no knife could stop and no law could easily punish. Once that suspicion took hold, every new scream seemed to confirm it. Soon, the girls were no longer alone. Other young women in the village began showing similar symptoms or claimed to feel the same invisible torment. They pointed, cried out, and named the people they said were hurting them. The room no longer felt like a sick room. It felt like a courtroom before the trial had even begun. And that was the shift Salem never recovered from. The moment the village stopped asking what was wrong with the girls and started asking who had done this to them. Once Salem accepted that the girls were bewitched, the village needed something even more dangerous than an explanation. It needed a culprit. The pressure built inside the Paris household first, then spilled outward. Adults questioned the girls again and again, pushing for answers, pushing for names, and eventually, names came. The first was Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Paris's home. She was vulnerable, foreign, and already easy for the village to imagine as someone standing closer to the unknown. In a frightened community, difference does not stay neutral for long. Then came Sarah Good, poor, angry, half-starved, wandering from door to door asking for food and shelter. She had the kind of face people remembered after an argument, the kind of presence a village tolerates only until fear gives it permission to turn cruel. And then, Sarah Osborne, older, sickly, and already mistrusted for personal choices that had pushed her outside the strict expectations of Salem. She had not been living the life this village wanted to see, and now that became its own kind of evidence. That was the pattern from the beginning. Salem did not reach first for the powerful. It reached for the exposed, the women with the least protection, the people already standing at the edge of trust. Once those names were spoken, memory itself began to change. A harsh word now sounded like a curse. A refused favor now looked like revenge. An unlucky illness, a dead animal, a child waking in terror in the night, all of it could be gathered up and laid at someone's feet. Then Tituba confessed. Whether she did it from terror, exhaustion, pressure, or a desperate instinct to survive, the effect was immediate. She did not simply admit to dark forces. She described a hidden world moving through Salem, a widening threat, a conspiracy that made the village's worst fears sound real at last. That confession did not calm anyone. It electrified them. If one witch had been found, there must be others. If the devil had entered Salem once, then he had not come alone. And from that moment on, accusation was no longer just an answer to fear. It was becoming a kind of power. At first, the accusations seemed to follow a pattern. They moved toward the poor, the disliked, the already vulnerable. But Salem did not stay there for long. Once the village discovered that an accusation could command attention, settle old tensions, and turn fear into authority, the trials began to change. This was no longer just panic, it was becoming useful. A girl could cry out in court, and grown men would stop to listen. A trembling hand could point across the room, and a life might begin to collapse before noon. The accused were expected to defend themselves against things no one could see, no one could touch, and no one could disprove. If a girl screamed when you looked at her, that could be taken as evidence. If she fell into a fit at the sound of your voice, that too could be evidence. The most dangerous thing in Salem was no longer witchcraft. It was the idea that invisible harm could be treated as fact. That changed the balance of the entire village. Private grudges suddenly had a public stage. Land disputes, family rivalries, bruised pride, old insults, suspicions that had been buried for years, all of them could now step into court wearing the language of righteousness. People who had once been ignored could influence magistrates. People with status could protect themselves by joining the hunt rather than questioning it. And once fear starts rewarding the loudest voices, moderation dies quickly. To hesitate looked weak, to doubt looked dangerous. To defend the accused could make others wonder what exactly you were trying to hide. So the trials fed themselves. Each new arrest made the last one feel justified. Each confession made the panic harder to challenge. Salem began to mistake momentum for truth, as if the sheer number of accusations proved that the devil really was moving from house to house. By then, the village was no longer reacting to fear. It was being reorganized by it. And the more power the accusations gained, the less anyone wanted them to stop. The courtroom was crowded long before the questioning began. Boots scraped against the floorboards, wet coats dripped by the door. People leaned forward on benches waiting for the girls to enter, because by then everyone knew the hearing would not stay calm for long. The accused stood in the center of the room while magistrates watched from above. Then one of the girls gasped, another pointed. A third began to shake so hard she had to be held upright. Within seconds, the whole room had turned, not toward the judges, but toward the performance unfolding beside them. No one called it a performance, of course. In Salem, this was treated as proof. If a girl screamed when the accused looked her way, it mattered. If she claimed a spectre was pinching her, choking her, whispering to her, the court listened. Things no one else could see were suddenly shaping real decisions. That was the trap. A normal defense could not work here. Deny the charge and you looked cold. Panic and you looked guilty. Pray too well and some thought you were pretending. Fail to pray and they thought the devil had your tongue. Each hearing fed the next one. The stories grew darker. The accusations came faster. People left the courtroom carrying fresh fear back into the village, where it spread from house to house by nightfall. And once Salem accepted invisible evidence, almost anyone could be pulled into reach. By summer, the fear had left the courtroom and moved into everyday life. It was there in the road between houses, in the silence after a greeting, in the way doors closed a little faster at dusk. People who had lived side by side for years began watching each other with new eyes. A woman could be accused for something as small as a quarrel that never quite died. A farmer might remember a boundary dispute from 5 years earlier and hear it differently now. A family that had always seemed proud suddenly looked secretive. A neighbor who kept to herself no longer seemed private. She seemed dangerous. Children listened, servants listened. Husbands and wives listened to each other more carefully than before. In Salem, ordinary speech had become risky. An angry word, a muttered threat, even a joke said at the wrong moment could return later in court with a darker meaning attached to it. The accused did not come only from the margins now. Respectable people began to feel the net tightening around them. Church members, landowners, women with standing in the community, even those who had once believed the trials would protect them, started to realize that protection meant very little once suspicion was loose in the village. Some confessed to save their lives, others named more names. That choice pushed the panic forward. Every confession seemed to prove the last accusation. Every new arrest made the whole nightmare feel harder to challenge. And so Salem kept moving in the same direction, deeper into the logic of fear. The village no longer needed solid evidence. It had something more powerful now: momentum. Soon, even people with influence and status would discover that the accusations were no longer staying near the edges. They were moving straight toward the center. Then, the accusations climbed higher. Up to that point, many in Salem could still tell themselves the danger was limited. The poor, the difficult, the people already talked about in whispers. But fear does not respect class for long. Once it gets what it wants from the margins, it starts testing the center. Names with weight began entering the room. John Proctor was accused. So was his wife, Elizabeth. George Burroughs, a former minister, was dragged back into the story. These were not faceless outsiders. These were people with standing, memory, enemies, and defenders. People other villagers knew well, people who should have been harder to touch. That was what made it worse. Because once Salem saw respected names under suspicion, the old comfort vanished. This was no longer a hunt for strange women at the edge of village life. The accusations had crossed a line. They were moving through farms, across family names, into church history, into the kind of households that thought they were protected by reputation. The village changed again. People spoke more carefully. Some stopped speaking at all. A public defense of the accused could be remembered later. A show of doubt could look like sympathy. And sympathy by then was dangerous. Even the pattern of survival had become twisted. Confess, and you might live. Refuse, and you could die insisting on your innocence. Salem was now rewarding lies and punishing resistance, which meant the court was no longer separating truth from falsehood. It was teaching people which answer kept them breathing. And once a system begins doing that, it is already very close to the point where blood follows. By the time the executions began, Salem had been living inside fear for months. The accusations no longer shocked people. The arrests no longer felt unusual. Even death, once it arrived, came wrapped in the language of duty. The condemned were taken to Gallows Hill, just outside the village. There, in open view, the trials reached their final form. Not argument, not prayer. Punishment. The crowd watched as neighbors, servants, mothers, and church members were led to the place where the rope waited. The first hanging came in June. More followed in July. Then more again in August. Each execution was meant to prove that order was being restored. Instead, each one dragged the village deeper into moral ruin. A government that claims to be saving itself by killing the innocent does not become stronger. It becomes harder to stop. One death stood apart from the rest. Giles Corey refused to enter a plea. For that, he was laid on the ground, boards placed over his body and stones piled on top of them, one by one, until the weight crushed the life out of him. He would not speak the words the court demanded. According to tradition, his final answer was simple: more weight. That detail survived because it felt larger than the trial itself. For a moment, Salem's machinery of fear met something it could not bend. But even that did not stop the court. Not yet. By the end, 19 people had been hanged. The village had crossed too far to pretend it was still searching for truth. It was defending the panic with bodies. And once blood enters a story like this, doubt begins to return. Slowly at first, then all at once. Doubt did not arrive in Salem with courage. It arrived with discomfort. By the early autumn of 1692, too many names had been spoken, too many bodies had already dropped, and the accusations were no longer staying where people expected them to stay. They were reaching into better homes, touching stronger reputations, circling too close to the kind of people the colony could not afford to dismiss as easily as beggars and servants. That changed the sound of the whole crisis. What had once felt righteous began to feel unstable. Magistrates were still listening, ministers were still preaching, the court was still moving, but beneath it all, confidence had started to thin. Some of the strongest criticism came from men who had supported the trials at first. Increase Mather, one of the most respected ministers in New England, finally pushed back against the logic that had carried Salem this far. Better, he argued, that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person be condemned. It was a simple idea, but in Salem it landed like a crack in a wall. Governor William Phips began to pull back as well, especially after the accusations brushed too close to his own household. Once power felt its own skin at risk, skepticism suddenly became easier to find. That is often how panics begin to die, not when ordinary people suffer, but when the circle of danger widens enough to frighten the people in charge. The special court was dissolved. Spectral evidence, the invisible core of the whole nightmare, began losing its authority. The machinery did not stop in a single clean motion, but it was breaking now. The momentum that had carried Salem forward for months was finally slipping. And once a panic starts losing certainty, it leaves something uglier behind. Not justice, not relief. The silence that comes after people realize what they have done. When the court finally lost its grip, Salem grew quieter. The screaming stopped first, then the hearings, then the steady procession of neighbors being pulled from their homes and marched into rooms where fear had already decided too much. What remained was the kind of silence people carry badly: a table with one chair left empty, a farm neglected through one season too many, a family trying to speak normally again and failing. Some prisoners came home. They came back to damaged property, unpaid debts, cold stares, and the knowledge that the people who had watched them accused were still living just up the road. Others never returned at all. Their names stayed in the village, but their voices were gone. In the years that followed, there were apologies, regrets, and payments to some families. None of it changed the hill where the executions took place. None of it gave those months back. Salem had already shown what could happen when fear moved faster than judgment, and the court began listening to terror as though it were testimony. That is why the trials lasted in memory. People could see even then that something had broken far deeper than one case or one season. A whole community had handed its conscience over to panic and called it righteousness. The names still hold: Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, Martha Corey, Giles Corey, George Burroughs. Salem buried them. History did not. You've been watching The Unseen Past.